So we have a lot to talk about today. Kanye West and his recent online tirade and plenty more. But before we do, tell us a little bit about your organization, Cyberwell.
Cyberwell is the first ever open database of online anti Semitism. We're actually a nonprofit initiative, fully independent and working globally directly with social media platforms to help better enforce and improve their digital policies or community standards and remove anti Semitic content at scale.
Okay, so this is work that is incredibly important, and there are a number of things currently happening right now globally, especially since October 7th. Obviously, anti Semitism has been a major issue throughout the history of humanity, but of late, we have seen a rise in it. Can you talk about, particularly in the cyber world online, the current state of anti Semitism, how bad it has gotten?
Sure. Cyberwell recently released an annual report that was really unpacking the state of online anti Semitism in 2024. And as you mentioned, because of the October 7th attacks, which was really the first successful hijacking of our social media platform by the terrorist group Hamas, we've seen a repeated cycle of really flooding social media platforms with deeply graphic, violent content, literally documenting physical harm of Jewish people into these high engagement algorithms. And that was true on the October 7th attacks. We also saw that repeat itself in the Amsterdam pogrom that happened only a few months ago. So we've seen this cycle of how there is really almost a fetishizing of physical harm towards Jewish people online in these attacks. But in terms of the overall discourse, it has also mirrored a very clear uptick in hostile, overtly violent calls to violence specifically. Cyberwell tracked in the first 3 weeks after October 7th a 65% increase in Arabic content that was calling for violence against anti-Semitism. And overall, we've seen a very worrying shift to very dehumanizing language when it comes to speaking about Jewish people online. We see that the two leading narratives online today are really characterizing Jews as the enemy and Jews as evil. And this is a very worrying narrative shift when we look at anti-Semitism online.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And, with the internet, there's anonymity on some of these platforms. You don't have to put your face and your name to what you're saying. And that opens up a whole other can of worms across the board on every issue when people can suddenly be unfettered in what they're saying. You would hope people wouldn't say these things as human beings, but yet they do. And when they can hide, it gets even worse. Now, Kanye West recently went on what has been described as a tirade, some very disturbing comments, messages on X about Hitler, about Jewish people. What was your reaction to some of that?
Well, I think it's important to know that this is not the first time that Kanye West has actually abused social media platforms and their powerful algorithms to spread vitriol and hate, not only against Jewish people, but against women, against LGBTQ people, right? Against people who are mentally challenged. Really, multiple marginal communities were attacked here, but really the Jewish community was the number one target. And the glorification of Hitler is absolutely something beyond the pale. And what's important to understand is that, again, not the first time that this specific celebrity has abused social media platforms to do this. One thing that I can tell you that was different about this attack versus the attack that happened digitally in October 2022 with Kanye West is that this tirade against Jewish people was almost exclusively amplified on the platform X. And it was amplified specifically by known anti-Semitic accounts, known accounts that spread anti-Semitism, that Cyberwell has been monitoring and actually sharing violations directly with X. And I can go into some of the narratives that Kanye West specifically said and the clear, sharp rise that we saw afterwards, the echo chamber that was created around these anti-Semitic narratives. But I really want to back up here a second and address what you're saying. Kanye West is not anonymous, right? Kanye West has a 32 million follower strong account on Twitter. And in total across social media, it's well over 50 million accounts. So we're talking about a potential reach here of over 50 million accounts. And then you have kind of the anonymous spreaders of anti-Semitism, as you mentioned, that really act as catalysts to spread this even further and be the echo chamber for this type of anti-Semitism. What do these two things have in common is that they both have accounts on Twitter, or these people all have accounts on the social media platforms themselves. And I think that we're missing a bigger piece of the puzzle here, which is that the expectation should be on the social media platforms to enforce their policies at scale. right? All of the content, all of the anti-Semitic narratives and accusations that Kanye West was spreading in this hateful tirade, the accusations that Jews were behind 9/11, the accusations that Jews control Black people, that they control the banks, all of that is actually prohibited content on social media platforms. When people are using these social media platforms, the companies are making a promise to us that this is not the type of content that's going to be amplified on their platform. So Kanye West, the positive news, has already deleted his Twitter account. That's great. Nobody signed up to hear that for the rest of their lives. But I really think that the bigger call to action here is to expect for social media platforms to enforce their policies at scale. Because to be frank with you, for the Jewish community, which is currently experiencing one of the worst onslaughts of anti-Semitism that it ever has, this is extremely dangerous content and extremely dangerous, hateful calls against the community.
Yeah, and this is going to be probably sound like a strange question, but I think it's one we have to address because there's been such a concern over free speech, right? This debate about free speech, and where is that line? And there have been numerous examples of people simply stating opinions, not anti-Semitic opinions about issues, right? Whether it was COVID and you had this reaction to them where it was almost like a cancellation, right? For simply asking questions. And so the pendulum seems to keep swinging, right? So the pendulum right now is swinging towards unfettered free speech, quote unquote. Is there a balance in your view? Because you're dealing with this every day when it comes to these platforms to say, hey, we're not going to restrict you for an opinion that is reasonable, right? But you can't be hateful. Talk a little bit about that. I know that's difficult, that balance.
Sure, it is. It's a challenge, but one of the ways that Cyberwell addresses this in terms of the way that we work as a trusted partner with the social media platforms is that all of the content that we flag for them is actually rules violating. So we learn and study their digital policies, and all of the analysis and data that we share directly with them is according to their own rules. So we really approach it from a compliance perspective. And even Mark Zuckerberg on his recent interview with Joe Rogan said very openly, an internet company or a private tech company does not guarantee you the right to free speech. And that is absolutely true. It's true on Twitter, just like it's true on Facebook. I think that this episode of Kanye's second anti-Semitic meltdown and attack against Jewish people is actually very indicative of why abusing social media platforms to spread hate is not a form of free speech. Kanye West got this message, hateful message, again, at a very sensitive and violent time when Jews are experiencing waves of violence, right? Got that out to 32 million people just by tweeting from his account. Okay, so that's a really clear example in terms of the mechanism of how speech and content and hatred are spread on these platforms actually is very not indicative of classic free speech when we think about it. Classic free speech from the constitutional perspective in the United States of America is what the government can and cannot tell you to do, say, think, or write. We don't go into how that content is then circulated at all. And I actually think that the other issue that you raised here is the fact that this space isn't regulated. There are no transparency requirements, and there is no legal reform that's been done perceivably since the 1990s, and this technology has exploded, really does leave a vacuum where government censorship and intervention can be a problem. But that remains true of the Biden administration as much as it does of the Trump administration, because the laws simply aren't there. But again, when this episode exactly challenges people to think, what is the difference between free speech and paid speech, or free speech and algorithmically charged speech? When you think about free speech, do you really mean that anytime you write or say something, it could reach 30 million people? Probably not.
Right. No, that's a great point. And I think they're very difficult topics, but you raise another important point there too about one of the reasons why these companies seem so reactive, right? I mean, people have wondered, well, why did Zuckerberg and Meta, why were they so willing to listen to the government under the Biden administration? Why are they so willing to come alongside even before Trump was in the Trump administration? And it may be, I'm just saying, this is an idea, because you want to avoid having laws created around you, right? You want to get along with whoever's in power so that you don't get regulated. And whether or not they should be regulated is another conversation. We could do a whole other episode on that, but it is interesting because you are going to have these swings back and forth when different ideologies come into office on a presidential level, right?
Absolutely. As long as the social media and internet and technology space remains one of the most unregulated industries, you will see the swingings back and forth based off of the administration that is currently elected, right? But what does that mean for marginalized communities or communities that are at the moment truly experiencing one of the worst waves of targeted violence against them, like the Jewish community? Even Mark Zuckerberg, on the same conversation that I referenced, Joe Rogan, said, this is 2025. There is no difference between the physical world and the digital world. So if that's their ethos as these CEOs of the tech companies, it makes total sense that we are also looking in a very critical and vigilant way on the spread of hatred and attacks against different communities online. I'll share with you also that there is new data coming out from the American Jewish Committee. It was a recent survey about anti Semitism in America. 67% of Jews, 67% of them experienced anti Semitism, including direct attacks against them in comments and DMs. Okay, 1 in 3 of them in the last year alone. So the social media platforms for the Jewish community are one of the most acute channels by which we experience anti Semitism as direct attacks, but also that this very old hatred is actually spread globally to millions of people.
So right now, just to kind of put a bow on this conversation, and we'll have you back again because there's a lot more. I know there'll be a lot more to talk about as time goes on here. If you could give advice right now to X, to Meta, what would your advice be in terms of what we need to do to help stop anti-Semitic hatred online?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, just using this episode as kind of a case study, number one, for X, we saw that known anti Semitic accounts that we had been flagging and been reporting were really involved in spreading Kanye West's hateful messages far and wide across X. We want to see full accountability and the implementation and of enforcement of their existing rules. And for Meta, I would actually say this is a use case to re-examine your announcement when it comes to rolling back automatic filters that are meant to preemptively remove known hate speech, right? If you looked at the language of Kanye West tweets, this is easily something that we can create automated tools to actually enforce digital policies at scale. And again, it comes from a kind of acknowledgement of the moment and the mechanism of social media platforms. I want to put this another way, leave you with a thought, okay? Every American knows that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Why? Because people are going to get hurt. When it comes to the Jewish community, we're already in a crowded theater and people are hitting us with live fire. So we need to remain vigilant about the expectation that these social media platforms enforce their policies at scale, especially when it comes to spreading the oldest form of hatred, anti Semitism.
Well, I so appreciate you breaking this all down. If people want to get more information on your work that you're doing there at Cyberwell, where can they go to do that?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, Cyberwell launched the first ever open database of online anti Semitism. That's because we want you to be able to see what it is when we're saying anti Semitism. What does that actually mean? That's available to you at app.cyberwell.org. All of our research, our analysis, our alerts that we share with the platforms is available at cyberwell.org/reports.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming out with us today.
So much.